In early 1991, the Iraqi desert was supposed to be the graveyard of American ambition. The world's fourth largest army was dug into the sand, armed with thousands of Soviet-made tanks and hardened by a decade of constant warfare. Most experts predicted a bloodbath, a mechanical stalemate that would cost thousands of American lives. They claimed the high-tech M1 Abrams was too fragile for the heat, too thirsty for the desert, and too complicated for real combat. But when the dust settled after just 100 hours of ground war, the reality was so one-sided it defied military logic. Today, we are stripping away the myths of Desert Storm to see how the Abrams didn't just win a war. It staged a mechanical execution that changed the face of the armored world forever. The road to the Persian Gulf was paved with deep anxiety and political skepticism. For years, the Pentagon's critics had mocked the M1 Abrams, calling it a gas guzzler and a logistic nightmare that wouldn't last a day in a real desert. The main point of contention was its revolutionary AGT 1500 gas turbine engine. While every other tank in the world, from the German Leopard to the Soviet T-80, used traditional diesel or specialized piston engines, the Americans had essentially put a modified jet engine inside a 60-ton steel box. Critics argued that the fine, talcum-like sand of the Middle East would be sucked into the high-speed turbines, melting the blades and turning the world's most expensive tank into a stationary target in a matter of hours. As the massive American buildup, known as Operation Desert Shield, began, the pressure on tank crews was monumental. They weren't just preparing for a tactical fight, they were fighting a war against the environment itself. To keep the jet engines breathing, crews had to perform grueling, non-stop maintenance, cleaning massive air filters every few hours, even in the middle of blinding sandstorms. This was the first open loop of the war. Could a machine designed for the cold, muddy plains of West Germany survive in a place where the air itself was an abrasive weapon? The logistics tale was staggering, requiring a constant, uninterrupted flow of JP-8 fuel that the world had never seen for a single armored division in motion. Beyond the engine, the Abrams carried a secret weapon that the Iraqi leadership couldn't even comprehend: the Chobham composite armor. Developed in secret collaboration with the British, this armor wasn't just a thick slab of steel. It was a complex, multi-layered sandwich of ceramics, high-strength metals, and specialized plastics designed to shatter the focused jets of chemical energy rounds. However, before the first shot was fired in the desert, no one truly knew if it could stand up to the Soviet-designed 125mm kinetic penetrators of the elite Iraqi Republican Guard. The Abrams was walking into a high-stakes duel against a battle-hardened enemy with equipment that was, until that very moment, purely theoretical in a real-world scenario. The Iraqi army was far from a joke on paper. They had spent 8 long years in a brutal war of attrition against Iran, and their tankers were experienced, combat-tested professionals. They had spent months building sophisticated kill zones in the desert, defensive lines of tanks buried in the sand, and shielded by massive earthen berms that were nearly invisible from the front. Their plan was simple: wait for the heavy American tanks to get bogged down in the soft sand, and then pick them off with massed, stationary fire from their Soviet-made optics. The Iraqis believed their equipment was enough for the flat, open terrain. What they didn't realize was that the Americans weren't just bringing a better tank. They were bringing a different dimension of digital warfare altogether. As the deadline for the ground war approached, the mood inside the Abrams platoons was a tense mix of intense focus and tech paranoia. These 4-man crews were sitting on top of the most advanced ballistics computers ever sent into battle, but they were surrounded by an ocean of fire. The burning oil wells, lit by Saddam's retreating forces, turned the midday sky into a pitch-black void filled with oily soot and toxic smoke, creating a surreal, hellish landscape where day looked like the end of the world. It was in this zero-visibility arena that the Abrams would have to prove its iron vision was more than just a marketing gimmick. It had to be the difference between life and a catastrophic explosion. When the order to advance finally came, the Iraqis were met with a terrifying mechanical reality. They literally couldn't hear the Americans coming until it was too late. The gas turbine engine of the Abrams doesn't clatter, rattle, or roar like a traditional diesel. It produces a high-pitched, jet-like whine that is easily swallowed by the desert wind and the sound of the wind. By the time an Iraqi sentry heard the whispering death, the 70-ton tanks were already cresting the dunes at over 40 miles per hour. This incredible power-to-weight ratio allowed the Abrams to bypass Iraqi defensive perimeters entirely, appearing in sectors the Iraqi generals had dismissed as impassable, creating immediate, paralyzing chaos in the enemy's command and control. Then came the night, and with it, the absolute, undisputed dominance of the Abrams thermal imaging system. While the Iraqi tankers peered through their traditional optical sights, seeing nothing but black smoke, swirling sand, and the glow of oil fires, the American gunners saw the world in glowing high-definition heat signatures. To an Abrams gunner, an Iraqi tank hidden behind a sand berm or a wall looked like a bright, glowing beacon in a dark room. They could see the heat of the enemy's engine block, the friction heat of their tracks, and even the heat left on the ground where a vehicle had recently been parked. The hunt had begun, and the prey was effectively blind, fighting a ghost that could see through the very earth. The firepower unleashed by the M1A1 was nothing short of a mechanical execution. The 120mm smoothbore gun was firing the legendary silver bullets, depleted uranium sabot rounds. These projectiles are essentially heavy metal darts that do not explode. They rely on pure kinetic energy, traveling at nearly a mile per second. When they struck an Iraqi T-72, they didn't just penetrate the steel, they turned the armor into a liquid spray. The energy was so massive that the friction of the entry would ignite the oxygen inside the enemy tank, causing the ammunition to cook off instantly. This resulted in the iconic jack-in-the-box effect, where the turret of the Soviet tank would be launched dozens of feet into the air. One of the most legendary stories from the front involved an Abrams that became hopelessly stuck in a mud hole during a chaotic night engagement. As the crew waited for a recovery vehicle, 3 Iraqi T-72s emerged from the darkness, thinking they had found an easy kill. From a completely stationary, tilted position in the mud, the Abrams gunner engaged all 3 targets. The first T-72 was deleted at over 2,000 meters. The second was destroyed seconds later. The third Iraqi tank actually managed to fire back, scoring a direct hit on the Abrams' front hull. The crew felt a jolt that shook their bones, but the Chobham Armor didn't break. The Abrams fired its third shot, vaporizing the final T-72. A stuck American tank had just won a 3-on-1 duel without losing a single man. This level of overwhelming dominance created a steel rain effect that completely shattered the Iraqi morale. Iraqi tankers began abandoning their perfectly functional vehicles as soon as they heard the high-pitched whine of the turbines, realizing that their armor offered zero protection against the American darts. In many documented cases, the Abrams were engaging and destroying targets from 3,500 meters away, distances the Iraqis didn't even think were physically possible for direct-fire combat. The American crews weren't just winning a battle. They were proving that the reach of their technology had effectively ended the era of traditional tank-on-tank dueling, turning the desert into a one-way shooting gallery. To truly understand why the Abrams kept its crews in the fight for 10 or even 15 hours straight, you have to look at the human factor of its internal engineering. The interior of the Abrams was a climate-controlled, ergonomically designed sanctuary compared to the cramped, noisy, and oven-like interiors of the Soviet tanks. With high-end air filtration and adjustable seating, the American crews stayed relatively fresh and alert while their opponents were physically exhausted by the extreme heat and mechanical noise. This meant that after 3 days of constant movement, the Americans were still making split-second tactical decisions with clear heads, while the Iraqis were operating in a haze of total fatigue and disorientation. The Battle of 73 Easting remains the gold standard for Abrams' combat performance and situational awareness. In a blinding sandstorm with near-zero visibility, Captain H.R. McMaster's Troop E of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment stumbled directly into a massive division of Iraq's elite Republican Guard. It was a meeting engagement at point-blank range, exactly the kind of fight where the Iraqis thought their numbers would give them a chance. But the Abrams' advanced stabilization system allowed them to fire with surgical accuracy while surging over the uneven desert floor at full speed. In just 23 minutes of intense fire, the Americans destroyed over 50 tanks and dozens of APCs without losing a single M1. During this chaotic battle, the survivability of the Chobham composite armor was put to the ultimate test under real-world fire. Several Abrams were hit by Soviet-made 73mm cannons and even the heavy 125mm rounds from T-72s. In almost every recorded case, the enemy rounds simply bounced off or buried themselves in the outer sacrificial layers of the ceramic metal sandwich. The crews reported hearing a deafening metallic clang that rang through the hull, but the tanks kept moving, the electronics stayed online, and the guns kept firing. It was the first time in history that tankers felt truly invincible, a feeling that allowed them to drive with a level of aggression that paralyzed the Iraqi defenders. Another critical engineering feature that saved lives throughout the conflict was the innovative blowout panel system in the turret. In Soviet tanks, the ammunition was stored in an autoloader directly under the crew, meaning any penetration usually caused a total explosion that decapitated the tank and killed everyone instantly. The Abrams, however, stored its main gun rounds in a separate, heavily armored compartment with panels designed to blast outward if the ammunition ignited. In one instance, an Abrams was hit in the rear rack by an accidental friendly fire missile. While the ammunition cooked off in a massive fireball, the internal armored doors held shut, and the crew walked away with nothing more than ringing ears and a story of a miracle. By the end of the 100-hour ground war, the combat statistics were almost impossible to believe. Out of nearly 2,000 Abrams tanks deployed to the theater, only a handful were disabled, and most of those were due to massive anti-tank mines or friendly fire incidents in the confusion of the smoke. Not a single American tanker was killed by enemy tank fire during the entire conflict. This total dominance wasn't just about having a bigger gun. It was about a holistic system that integrated the pilot, the high-end optics, and the indestructible armor into a single, lethal organism. The Abrams had survived its trial by fire, and in doing so, it had rewritten the rules of land warfare for the next half-century. The final analysis of the Abrams in 1991 is the story of a weapon that ended the Cold War debate once and for all. It proved that quality, combined with high-end technology, is the ultimate force multiplier in modern war. A single Abrams brigade was worth more than an entire Iraqi armored corps because the Americans possessed the digital high ground. The overwhelming success of Desert Storm turned the Abrams into the global benchmark for armor, forcing every other nation, from Russia to China, to completely scrap their old designs and find a way to incorporate thermal sights and modular composite armor into their future fleets. The cultural legacy of the 91 campaign turned the Abrams into a global icon of American industrial strength. It was no longer just a tank. It was a symbol of the technological overmatch that defined the post-Vietnam era. For the public, the Abrams was the magic tank that could win a war without casualties. But for the soldiers who lived inside it, the M1A1 was the sacred steel that brought them home to their families through a storm of fire. This reputation ensured that the Abrams would receive continuous funding and radical upgrades for the next 30 years, evolving into the digital M1A2 system enhancement packages we see on the battlefield today. However, the Gulf War also taught a dangerous and seductive lesson: the idea that technology makes war easy and bloodless. This myth would eventually be challenged years later in the urban streets of Baghdad and the IED-filled roads of the Middle East, where the Abrams would face asymmetric threats it wasn't originally designed for. But in the open, flat desert of 91, the M1A1 was the perfect tool for a perfect mission. It was a machine built for a specific kind of high-intensity violence, and it executed that mission with a level of perfection that may never be seen again in the history of armored warfare. Looking back, the 1991 Abrams was the true grandfather of the digital soldier. It was the first time an armored vehicle was truly integrated into a network of satellites, GPS, and airborne command centers like the AWACS. The tank didn't just fire shells. It processed a mountain of information to stay ahead of the enemy's decision cycle. This shift from mechanical power to information power is what allowed a relatively small American force to dismantle the world's fourth-largest army. The Abrams was the pioneer of this revolution, proving that the most important part of a tank isn't just the thickness of its steel, but the speed and clarity of its digital brain. Standing in a museum today, an M1A1 from the Gulf War looks like a silent, weathered titan. Its angular lines and imposing size still radiate a sense of absolute industrial competence. It is a machine that changed the map of the world in just 4 days. From the whispering death that haunted Iraqi bunkers to the iron shield that protected American sons, the Abrams remains the ultimate tool of armored security. It is the machine that turned the desert sands into a permanent monument to armored excellence, a sovereign predator that still rules the plains of the modern battlefield with an iron fist. The M1 Abrams in Desert Storm was more than just a successful tank. It was a technological declaration of superiority. It proved that in the modern era, the combination of superior vision, turbine speed, and crew-first engineering is a formula that cannot be beaten by numbers alone. It remains the king of the ground, a 70-ton masterpiece of fire and absolute resilience that redefined the very meaning of victory. Thank you for joining us on this extended look at the Steel Rain of 1991. Was the Abrams victory a result of pure engineering, or were the Iraqi forces simply unprepared for this level of warfare? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe as we continue to explore the fire and steel of history. Peace out.